Trails of Cold Steel 2 came out in 2014 for PS3 and PS Vita in Japan, as well as other surrounding regions of Asia 1 year after Cold Steel 1. It was released in North America and Europe in 2016 for those same platforms. It got a worldwide PC version in 2018, Japan received a PS4 version alongside Cold Steel 1 in that same year, and then that specific version was released in the West a year later in 2019. Just like with Cold Steel 1, it also got a Switch version in 2021, but that's Asia only. The game takes place about a month after Cold Steel 1, and actually, in the grand scheme of things, continues Cold Steel 1's pattern of mostly being an interquel instead of a sequel. The 1 month gap between Cold Steel 1 and 2 lines up with Trails to Azure's Fragment chapter, and the majority of Cold Steel 2 coincides with Azure's final chapter, even sharing a few thematic similarities as both conflicts come to a close. The battle system is mostly the same as Cold Steel 1, and since I already covered all of that in the Cold Steel 1 review, I won't be repeating myself here. There are some new things they've added though. First of all orbment slots now have levels ranging from 0 to 2. Upgrading these slots allows you to equip rarer quartz. Character animations, at least in battle, also look noticeably smoother and more natural than they did in Cold Steel 1. It doesn't affect gameplay mechanics, I just thought I'd bring it up because it is just that noticeable. The link system has a new feature called Overdrive. It's similar to the burst feature in Trails to Azure. 2 linked characters can enter Overdrive, which changes the scenery, heals a chunk of HP and CP, and gives the player 3 free turns. The character who initiated the overdrive gets 2 turns, and the character they were linked with gets 1, for a total of 3. In Overdrive, every attack, except for arts and S-crafts, are a guaranteed unbalance, so this is a good way to build up brave points if you're low on that. Arts also have no casting time and go off instantly. There is a resource, an orb, that sits in the top right part of the screen. It needs to be filled every time you want to enter Overdrive. When you first unlock Overdrive, Reen can link with everyone, including people who join the party later. For the characters besides Reen to be able to overdrive with each other, you'll have to clear special blue chests that appear all over the country. Basically boss chests that force you to use the 2 characters mentioned in the description, or sometimes 4, as you'll encounter later in the game, and if you beat them, then they can all overdrive together. This game also has a far stronger emphasis on Divine Knight battles this time. You got to do a couple at the end of Cold Steel 1, but they flesh it out way more here. Divine Knights function similarly to being on foot. You can attack, use crafts, there's also a defend option which will heal you for a bit and sharply cut any damage you receive. The biggest addition is Reen's other classmates being able to chip in and help instead of just warming the bench. You can assign 1 classmate at a time during battle. They come with the ability to replenish EP, heal HP and CP, and also allow Valimar to cast arts himself. It could be anything ranging from standard damaging spells to buffs, debuffs, or special effects. Each character has their own unique set of arts. Valimar also has his own quartz system which allows you to customize his parameters even further, though it's a lot more simplified than it is for the main cast. The art system also got an update, taking inspiration from the master arts in Trails to Azure. While most of it remains unchanged, there are special quartz you can obtain close to the end of the game, and they allow characters to use lost arts. Without spoiling anything, they have some very absurd effects and can really turn the tide on a hard fight. The catch is that unless you have EP cutting quartz or you land on a 0 arts turn bonus, which could affect your EP cost, lost arts, under normal circumstances, do drain all of your EP, and you can only use them once per fight. But for most of them, the effects are so good that it is worth it. And now I'm going to get into the characters and the story, so spoilers ahead. If you're still here, I'm assuming you've either played already or you don't care, so let's get into it. This game really puts Reen through the ringer, which is funny because he serves as the central mediator for Class 7 and their allies, but honestly, he seems like the one who goes through the most in this game. After building up the class from the ground up, because it was a coincidence that Reen would always get grouped with whichever 2 classmates were currently arguing at that point in the story. But anyway, Class 7 had come a long way, all of them coming from different walks of life, but eventually managing to set their differences aside and view each other as equals. And honestly, had it not been for Reen, it probably wouldn't have happened. He was the glue that held everyone together when things got shaky. And then all of that was ripped away from him within the span of a few hours. Osborne was shot, Noble Alliance capitalized on that opportunity, and Trista and the Academy were among the locations that were occupied. Reen was then forcibly removed from the battle and sent away. So almost a year's worth of effort was seemingly just gone. Just like that. Reen goes into a coma and sits in Valimar for a month. which actually lines up quite nicely with the time that Lloyd spent in prison. Upon waking up, Reen is then faced with the gargantuan task of tracking down his old friends, who at that point had been scattered across the country. His sister and the princess get kidnapped while under his watch. He probably feels immense guilt over not being able to save Vulcan and later Crow. Every time things start looking up for the guy, the plot just swoops in and puts him right back in the hole. I'm really trying to think of anything positive in this game that happened to Reen exclusively, so not counting any feel-good moments that apply to the whole class, just Reen on his own, and I don't think I can think of much. Like, during the intermission, he finally manages to control his powered-up white-haired form, which is actually pretty major because it becomes a usable craft during gameplay. He gets better at using his Divine Knight, Valimar, and the two do form a deeper, more natural friendship. But outside of that, yeah, not much else. Reen's purpose in this game was to unite the scattered cast of characters so that they could continue to develop, but outside of that, it almost felt like the entire game was one big hazing ritual for Reen. Elisa doesn't get much in this game, though to be fair, the entire Rhineford family got quite a bit of detailed information revealed about them in Cold Steel 1, so I guess it's not that big of a deal. They kind of take what they had established previously with her and her mother's relationship and build off of that. You kind of get to see how Elisa's mom treats her on a day-to-day basis, and unfortunately, it isn't great. I could give her the benefit of the doubt and say maybe she just doesn't realize it, or she's so busy with her work that she's kind of just forgotten how to be friendly, but that's kind of a reach honestly, though not completely out of the realm of possibility. Whichever way you slice it though, Elisa's mom is very hard on her daughter, to the point where she didn't even give her a simple thank you for coming to rescue her from house arrest. Well, train arrest, technically, but you get what I mean. Like, yeah, her intuition was correct on the fact that Class 7 would have to rescue her eventually, so that the Noble Alliance couldn't leverage the Rhineford Company anymore, but you still could have at least thanked her, like, come on, lady. And it is revealed in a side quest sometime later that Elisa's mom does still think about her deceased husband and the family they once had quite frequently. So yeah, it's a deeper dive into Elisa trying to get through to her mom, but from the player's omniscient point of view, it is kinda nice to know that even though Irina has an icy exterior that would make Claire blush, and Elisa frequently tries, and often fails, to break through it, there is still a heart buried under there. I think. I really just ought to lump Elliot, Laura, Gaius, and Machias into one category. I'm not going to do that because that's not really any fun, but I could because they don't really do anything in this game. They don't have any unique additions to their character arcs, they're kind of just there. Elliot still likes music and his dad said he can go to music school after the war. When Class 7 split up, he, Machias, and Fee ran off to Keldic and sort of stayed under the radar until Reen showed up. Those are literally the most important things that happened to Elliot in this game. Laura still has a big sword and still does stupid amounts of damage. She went to Legram along with Emma and Eustace before the latter split off to deal with family business. Gaius went back to Nord along with Elisa and Milliam after they lost Trista, and he's been helping his family who had to move over to a new settlement because of the war. I think he even toned down on his win comments a bit, which is unacceptable, but whatever. He's got 2.5 more games to clean up his act, I guess. Topping off the quartet of didn't do much and I gotta grasp at straws just to give them a section in this part of the video is Machias. Now granted, Machias, just like with Elisa, did get some pretty good coverage in the first game, so him being in the background in this game isn't as bad as the others I just mentioned. His father, being the governor and all, did get arrested shortly after the war broke out. They briefly mention that, but he kind of becomes an afterthought until close to the end of the game when you actually go to rescue him. So he's basically just a glorified Princess Peach if anything. Machias still does have his rivalry with Eustace as well, though it feels more playful than anything, and their disagreements at least don't put a strain on the team like it did in the last game. Fee's development in this game is heavily tied to the idea of found family, something they touched on in Cold Steel 1 and continue to explore in this game. If you did her bonding event in Cold Steel 1, she mentions how she sees Class 7 as her new family, which is funny because she ends up losing most of them when they split up at the end of the game. Truth is, Fee never really had a family that stuck around for significant amounts of time. She didn't know her biological family, she was adopted by Zephyr's leader and joined the Corps as a result of this, but then they disbanded when he died. Then Sarah found her, which wasn't a coincidence by the way, and she got comfortable with Class 7, before losing them too. Honestly, out of all the good guys, I would say Fee probably had it the second worst behind Reen, just due to the repetition of bad things happening to her and having to start from scratch so many times. Early into the game, she encounters Zeno and Leonidas, two former members of Zephyr that I will go into detail about later, but they were all pretty close too back when they were working together. Fee struggles with the confusion as to why they would abandon her if they care about her so much, an answer she doesn't receive until she learns to confidently stand on her own 2 feet, and definitively prove her independence by helping Reen and the others to pull Class 7 back together against all odds. Like, they didn't need to give me more reasons to like Fee, but I guess it couldn't hurt, you know? Eustace actually does get quite a bit of spotlight in this game due to his family having a significant role in the Noble Alliance, which I will get into later. With Eustace himself, however, you really get to see how all of this affects him internally. When most of the other cast members fell on hard times and everyone tried to offer them sympathy, the character in question would usually lean into it and accept the help. Eustace reacted the opposite way. Every time something messed up happened and the Albarea family was responsible, he firstly took it extremely personally, and second, would usually try and leave the group thinking that these issues were his burden alone to fix. And at first glance, you might think he was just being a prick, but I do think it's a lot deeper than that. He takes it personally because he's the sole member of his immediate family that's actually opposed to what's going on, and if something unfortunate did happen to his father and brother, that would leave them unable to run House Albarea. He would become its new duke. He wanted to separate himself from the class and go at it on his own, not because he dislikes his classmates, well, except maybe Machias, but because he's concerned for their safety. It's less so you're not good enough to fight with me, and more so you didn't cause this and I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you while trying to solve my problems. Of course, Reen and company tell him that he's full of shit and friends stick together and help each other out through thick and thin. You've heard it all before, but in JRPGs it works just as well today as it did yesterday. We get a little bit more of Emma in this one, just a bit though. As we learned back in Cold Steel 1, she and Vita came from the same village and trained under the same master. In a weird case of what almost feels like self-awareness on the writer's part, she does feel some guilt for keeping her friends in the dark regarding her duties as a witch, and being sent to Thors mainly to keep an eye on the Divine Knight as well as searching for Vita. Near the end of the second act, it is heavily implied that Emma herself was kept in the dark about a lot of things that her job entails. I wish I could give you more details, but honestly, even at that point the game was very vague about exactly what was up. Namely the fact that not only are the events of the War of the Lion cyclical and destined to happen from time to time, but the Hexen clan specifically is tasked with omitting the finer details of each cycle's conclusion. Does leave a lot to the imagination, like what could have possibly happened that would have called for an erasure of memory on that scale, but the game never goes too far into that. Very similar to Fee, Emma's experiences do give her a new wave of confidence as she now realizes the extent of her abilities and vows to stand by her friends through thick and thin. Celine is Emma's cat, who, ironically, is kind of a bitch. Okay, I don't think she intentionally does it, she just has a hard time reading the room. Witches from Emma's clan have familiars, basically pets, that accompany them on their travels. Vita has one as well, a bird named Grianos. Celine spends most of the game supporting Emma's less than stellar Hexen clan PR, as well as coaching Reen, especially during Divine Knight battles. A lot of Milliam's progress in this game is tied to who she is as opposed to her impact on Class 7, or the war. I have suspected for a while now that Milliam is not human. At first I thought maybe she was some kind of android, but if the credit scene was anything to go by, she might be like a test tube lab experiment or something. Anyway, a lot of the new things you learn about Milliam occurs during her bonding, specifically the one you do shortly after taking back Ruhr. Milliam tells Reen that she's never cried before. Even when Osborne died, she wasn't visibly sad about it, despite caring about him a lot. However, at the end of the Reverie corridor, Milliam does end up crying, as well as most everyone else. And it confuses her. She genuinely didn't realize how much she was going to miss hanging out with Class 7. If anything, it might be evidence that she valued her time as a student more than her position as an Ironblood, despite the former being the reason for her going to school in the first place. The best bracer you've never heard of. I finally read this guy's manga, as well as some of the other stuff related to his past. The Ring of Judgment manga was made sort of as a tie-in to Trails from Zero. I say this because it's called Zero no Kiseki Ring of Judgment, even though the special support section only shows up briefly, and the story mostly focuses on Estelle, Joshua, and Toval. Actually, not even really between Sky the Third and Zero. kind of during Trails from Zero, right before Estelle and Joshua introduced themselves before that baboon fight. The only thing that's really plot critical in the story, though, is they meet Ein Selnit near the end of the story, and she's the one who tells them that Ren went to Crossbell, and then that's how Estelle and Joshua ended up going to Crossbell to find Ren. And then, of course, there was also introducing Toval himself as a character, and then they kind of just assume you know him by Cold Steel 1. As far as his actual background, he grew up alone, an orphan, I guess, and then Micht, the guy who runs the pawn shop, took him in and taught him how to trade stolen goods. Sometime later, he met Ein, and she's the one who inspired him to become a bracer, and he's been doing that ever since. In this game specifically, he's the first one to find Reen and Celine after Reen wakes up from his coma, which makes him the first playable party member you get besides Reen himself. Kinda like with a good half of Class 7, he's also sort of just there lending support through his presence, but since he and the other two I'm about to cover are more so guest characters, it's mostly fine. Osborne's bitch. No, seriously though, what is her deal with Osborne? That man can do no wrong in her eyes. Anyway, she did appear frequently in Cold Steel 1 and makes her first playable appearance here. Of course, she works for the RMP. That automatically puts her on the reformist side of the conflict, not that she would have done any differently if she was working for someone else, but you get what I mean. That doesn't stop her from assisting Class 7 whenever she can. There isn't really much else to her in this game. She helps you out sometimes and she's Osborne's tier 3 simp. Moving on. We were all led to believe that Sharon was just a maid with a freakishly good work ethic. And then you get to the end of Cold Steel 1 and they drop the nugget. Sharon is also an enforcer for Ouroboros, number 9. Despite that, she makes it clear both in the last game and in this one that until the Civil War is over and done with, her loyalty is towards the Reinford Company. Except now the Civil War is over, so what are you gonna do now, Sharon? She's also the most recent objective in Anton's quest for love. It didn't end up working out, unfortunately. Although, even though she said no, she never said it was because she didn't like him. She basically implied that she had her hands full at the moment, so I don't know, maybe he still has a shot. We'll see. Sarah returns close to the game's midpoint, although unlike Toval, Claire, and Sharon, she remains with the party during Act 2 instead of going to Western Zemuria to help fight. She's a chronic beer drinker, and not much else is learned about her until you get to Oryx Fort. This is where the group runs into the Northern Jaegers, the same ones hired by Duke Alberea. They recognize Sarah, and that's because she's a former Jaeger herself. She's from North Ambria and used to belong to the Northern Jaeger Corps before becoming a bracer, so that explains why she's so good at fighting, as well as her ominous comments about her old self. Did I mention she's a chronic beer drinker? I'm grouping Alphen and Elise together because some of the stuff I have to say kind of applies to both of them. They both serve as goals for Reen, for lack of a better term. They get kidnapped by the Noble Alliance very early into the game, which doesn't do much to help Reen's feelings of inadequacy. He feels very guilty over it. Alphen is the first to get rescued during the intermission chapter, and from that point onward she sort of serves as a walking talking permission slip for the Crimson Wings to intervene whenever they need to. Elise was being held hostage near the capital along with the governor and the rest of the royal family. There actually isn't too much to Elise in this game outside of having a crush on Reen, but yeah, Alphen is the princess, Elise is the incest route. Moving on. Angelica's beef with her family continues. Because she belongs to House Ragnar, she's similar to Eustace in feeling at least partially responsible for her family's role in the war. The Ragnar family took over the Reinford corporate building and put Chairman Irina under house arrest, as I said earlier. Angelica's uncle was left in charge of that, while Marquis Ragnar oversaw his own province's contribution to the Noble Alliance. Angelica, with the help of Class 7, manages to rescue Irina, as I said before, as well as take back the Reinford building, which then left Angelica's father. Angie had a small number of sympathizers within the provincial army who were willing to go against her father's wishes and help her out. Together they snuck a few soldats and other military equipment away for themselves, and they head over to Schwarzdrache Barrier, the military base that the Ragnar family was in charge of, to face off against the Marquis. Angelica fights her father and comes out on top. And, due to already having mixed feelings on the Noble Alliance anyway, her father surrenders and relinquishes the Alliance's hold on Ruhr. It turns out Marquis Ragnar's only reasons for joining was possibly peer pressure, but mostly just his disdain for Osborne. You do realize after some time that he's not quite as slimy as Duke Cayenne or Alberea, and he has a lot of respect for the royal family, so he strongly disagreed with the Alliance placing them under house arrest in an attempt to silence them. Going back to Angie though, she's still got her old habits. No lollies are safe when she's on the prowl. Oh, and speaking of which, Workhorse Toa. She, along with George and Angelica, managed to slip away from the academy at the end of Cold Steel 1. Shortly afterwards, she was brought onto the Courageous, and I guess she helped them out until you finally meet her in person at the beginning of Act 2. When Victor Arside departs with Olivier, Toval, Claire, and Sharon to help fight in Western Erebonia, Olivier puts the ship in Class 7's care and Toa becomes the new captain. She even gets the hat, and honestly, she was a damn good leader. Don't let her size fool you. So yeah, just like in Cold Steel 1, Toa stays busy. Lloyd and Risha, to my great surprise, yes, these two are also in the game. It sort of fast forwards to the Occupation era where Lloyd and Risha are in the Geofront trying to back up some important data stored on a giant terminal. The section is pretty much just one large dungeon, but it was nice seeing these two again, and I will get into this segment of the game later. Thomas is an instructor at the academy. After the Noble Alliance occupied it, he slipped away and followed behind Class 7 from afar, helping to guide them out of harm's way from time to time. The only reason I mention him here is because of an important scene right at the end of the game, which the devs, in their infinite wisdom, made exclusive to New Game Plus. That's right, if YouTube didn't exist, you would have to play the game all over again and collect special items just to see what I'm about to tell you. So the items are called Black Records, and story-wise, Reen progressively gives the pieces to Thomas as he finds them, and then Thomas deciphers them. The records themselves provide some added details of ancient Erebonia from before and during the War of the Lions. The kicker though is what Thomas says afterward. Thomas reveals that he's the second Dominion of the Growlsritter, and Rosine, an NPC who was both a classmate and a church sister when she wasn't studying, is actually a squire working under him. So yeah, a pretty big thing to just leave out of the game unless you played it all over again. And what's even worse is that I hear there's no retreading of these events in Cold Steel 3. They say the next time Thomas is mentioned, they just assume you saw that scene. So yeah, that's a thing that exists. I guess for once the guy with the glasses ended up being somewhat of a twist hero instead of your typical Weissman clone. Wait, but Weissman used to work for the church too though. Oh god, he still has time to turn. Vulcan spends most of his time during the game lending a hand to the Noble Alliance's manpower whenever he's needed. He did say he was in charge of the Soldat training. It is worth noting, they don't call it Noble Alliance for nothing. The group of characters who make up the prominent members of the Alliance come from all walks of life. Great House leaders, provincial army generals, Liberation Front terrorists, Jaegers, and Ouroboros. Namely, 2 enforcers, a Stahlritter, and an Angus beef. It's very reminiscent of the group of unlikely villains that was formed in Trails to Azure. For, I would say, the first half of the game, Vulcan and Scarlet are both kind of just there. During the intermission, Vulcan reveals that he doesn't really care for the war, since they already accomplished his goal of killing the Chancellor, and he implies that he's been having a hard time finding purpose ever since that. Turns out the man wasn't lying. A little later, when the Crimson Wings are fighting House Ragnar in their attempt to free Ruhr from the Alliance's control, Vulcan shows up shortly after Angelica beats her dad, and he has his own special soldat which forces Reen to use Valimar to fight him. Vulcan wanted this though, and had intentionally overworked his soldat to the point where it was about to blow up from all that excessive activity. And despite Reen's pleas, Vulcan refused to eject, which basically makes this whole ordeal a self-Minecraft on his part, but it still ended up traumatizing Reen regardless. Then, when the Crimson Wings head over to Oryx Fort to arrest Duke Alberea, Scarlet shows up and tries the same shit. Although, she's a lot more open about her desire to, exit stage left. Fortunately, Reen manages to save her before that can happen, and while Scarlet was very disappointed, she does mention that she used to be a squire for the Septian Church. This is also the first time Reen learns about the Growlsritter, cause his conversation with Thomas isn't going to happen until way later. And as you know if you're familiar with the previous arcs, the Growlsritter is the militant arm of the church. But it just goes to show the level of despair some people can fall into when they dedicate their whole life to something. Sure, this could result from your ambitions failing, but even in that circumstance, if you fail at something, you at least have the sliver of optimism that maybe things could have worked out if things had been different, or if you had operated under different circumstances or what have you. There's always that what if that lingers when you fail. But what happens when you succeed? What happens when the goal that you lost everything for is finally accomplished, and you realize that things aren't as glamorous as you thought they'd be? There are no more what-ifs left to think about because you made it to the other side. In most cases, when you pull off something as groundbreaking as what the Liberation Front did, you can't just undo that and try something else. Well, maybe that wasn't the best thing to say, because this situation specifically is kind of a bad example because that's exactly what ends up happening, but you get what I mean. It's not like any of the characters were aware of that twist yet, but the dissatisfaction combined with the lack of hope of things getting better for you can lead people down some very unsavory lines of thought. It's also possible that for both Scarlet and Vulcan, they might have even looked ahead into after the war. They're terrorists, and even though they were being sponsored by the Noble Alliance, do you really think, had the Noble Alliance succeeded, that Duke Cayenne, Duke Alberea, and whoever else was in charge following the war, you really think they just let Scarlet, Vulcan, Crow, and the others just walk around and do whatever? Hell no. Remember, these were people capable of starting a revolution and turning the country upside down. The nobility wouldn't just let those same people run around under their new rule. Things wouldn't automatically be all hunky-dory for them. I could see them maybe striking a deal with Crow, considering Ordine might have been a bit too useful to just discard, but the other two? The future probably wasn't looking too bright for them anyway. Similar to Alfred and Elise, I'm lumping these two together because I don't think they're ever even seen on screen individually anyway. Zeno and Leo, as I said, were two Jaegers that were part of Zephyr alongside Fee. They kind of looked after her like older brothers. Actually, they're about as protective of Fee as Reen is with Elise, so yeah, make of that what you will. Besides that, they don't do too much besides giving the Noble Alliance some significant manpower, which, to be fair, I guess that's what Jaegers do best. After your final fight with them, they do reveal that the other members of Zephyr are on an assignment to revive their boss, which shocks Fee because, you know, he's dead. It's honestly this that leads me to believe Osborn cheating death was a resurrection and not them healing the wound or anything like that. It wouldn't surprise me if that's what they did with Osborn, and maybe they're going to take that same research and try that on other deceased characters. Just a hunch. Blue Blonde doesn't do much in this game, to be honest. It's not even really clear why he's helping the Noble Alliance either, beyond what I assume to be his own personal amusement. He does give Reen a nice recap of the LibreArc incident from his point of view, so I guess there's that. And it's nice to see him again regardless. Duvalie in this game is basically a walking, talking advertisement for Arianrod. I swear she probably spent like half of her total screen time hyping up Arianrod. It was actually a little scary. She also seems to have a visceral disdain for the Arside family, if her interactions with Laura are anything to go by. I do wonder what happened between the two that got under her skin so much, but they don't really talk about it in this game. Also, remember when she claimed she was on par with Luve in terms of strength? Well, it turns out that she did beat him after challenging him to 100 battles and winning on the 100th attempt. So yeah, while she's still strong, putting her up there with Luve is not very accurate. 100 battles over how long? Back to back, he probably got tired. 100 battles on and off, over a long period of time, he probably got sick of her asking and let her win just to shut her up. Oh, also, even I have to admit this, her voice actress is so fucking funny, man. She really nailed the character, especially when she gets mad. Makes it hard to take her seriously sometimes, but I guess that's also a part of her character, so it's fine. But yeah, I really do like her English voice actress.
I've already introduced myself. It's only proper for you to do... Ugh! Why are you still up there? Get down here right this instant! She is the leader of the Stallritter. The great light which guides us. Gallant yet beautiful, proud yet merciful. She's the strongest knight of all. And oh, she's simply divine. This is not the time to try and one-up each other. No! Come back here! Get back here, damn it!
Alright. This man here needs to be studied thoroughly. So McBurn is Enforcer number 1 of Ouroboros. In terms of personality and how he carries himself, McBurn is pretty chill, ironically. Actually, that's an understatement. He's quite lazy, much to Duvalie's annoyance. Most of the time, he doesn't want to help with whatever's going on, and he leaves all the heavy lifting to whoever he's paired up with. usually dutifully. He sits around expressing his apathy for the war, wishing he was doing anything else. At first glance, he seems like a complete slacker. But what if I told you that when Eidos was developing the game of life, she made this guy lazy on purpose to balance out his stats and keep the world from falling to ruin? Mick Byrne, by his own admission, is tied with Arianrod for the strongest fighter in Ouroboros, which would in turn make him one of the strongest characters in the entire series. The few times Mick Byrne does give enough of a damn to actually try, it's unreal. The dude's fucking broken. He can spontaneously summon fire at will, no orbment needed, and apparently it's not the same as the magic that Emma and Vita can use either, he can just do it. He also has a similar power to Reen's transformation where he can dye his hair and drastically increase his strength. And if that wasn't enough, cause yeah, we're not done yet, he has a sword. A gift from the Grandmaster just like Louvé's. And apparently this thing was such a big deal that Celine remarks that it shouldn't even be able to exist in their reality. Except it quite clearly does, so I'm not sure what she's talking about. So it turns out that this broken ass mage is also a broken ass swordsman. Even Laura's dad, pulling out all the stops, took one look at this dude and said, yeah, he's way stronger than me. I'm gonna have to borrow some of that power of friendship thing you kids keep talking about if I want to stand a chance here. That being said, he's still a very fun character, and all of his abilities, in my opinion, just make the scenes where he's just lazing around even more endearing. He's kind of like a semi-comic relief character, and it's just funny knowing that, with few exceptions, he could just absolutely broil the entire cast if he wanted to, but opts not to because he just can't be bothered. Vita is the routine, normal civilian who is actually an Angus beef the entire time and is also a really powerful mage, as was showcased by the end of Cold Steel 1. I'm just saying, it's kinda funny how it happened one time in every arc so far. Actually, before I continue, interestingly enough, you guys did tell me that she actually first showed up in Sky the Third, though she wasn't named. She was the woman who tried to hit on Kevin and then promptly failed because this man is so loyal it's pretty fucking scary, as well as also showing up by voice during the Angus beef meetings. She was the one who kidnapped Alphen and Elise. Altina did it on her orders, and what's funny is she kinda psychs out Reen and Toval by appearing to disapprove of Duke Alberea sending the Jaegers to attack Ymir, though based off of some of the things she says in the final dungeon. Which one? The first one. Based on her behavior there, she probably did mean it to some extent. Regardless, she still used that as an opportunity to snatch up Figurehead and incest bait and rub it in their faces. She shows up frequently, often via hologram, to either taunt the main heroes or, best case, to prod them into becoming stronger. Her primary goal throughout the entire story was to get Reen and Crow to fight each other with their Divine Knights. That's basically it. That's why she's helping the Alliance, that's why she summoned the Infernal Castle. It's also very apparent that this is the case after Reen defeats Crow, and like 80% of her hostility towards the main cast just evaporates. She and Crow just instantly bow out of Cayenne's plans. And then she even helps Class 7 when Duke Cayenne awakens the Testarossa, which, her words, was the one thing she forbade him from doing. I'm not really sure why Reen and Crow fighting was so important to her anyway. It's obviously important to both of them as well as the audience since they have a score to settle, but I'm not sure why it's important to Vita specifically. Like, yes, there is the whole memory wiping thing after each reenactment of the war, but it's heavily implied that that's at least one of the reasons why Vita left the clan, so I'm not sure. Maybe the cycle needed to be perpetuated one more time, or maybe Ouroboros is going to take advantage of it, or they possibly found some way to break it once things reach a certain point. The game doesn't really explain that. Maybe they will later into the arc, but yeah, it's kinda just left hanging. The most significant piece of information that you learn regarding Crow is his past, that being his childhood, where he grew up, and what ultimately led him down the path of terrorism. He grew up in Jirai, which used to be independent, it wasn't always part of the Empire. It was a city-state that specialized in maritime, or sea trade. Crow's parents died when he was very young, so his grandfather, who was also the mayor of the city, took care of him for most of his life. One of the areas that Jirai frequently did business with was North Ambria, which, if you remember, was the same place that got hit with the salt pail. Having one less place to trade with hit Jirai pretty hard. Crow's grandpa started looking into alternative ways to keep the city afloat, no pun intended, because, it was near water. That's when the Erebonian government came in and offered to build a railway through the city, which would connect Heimdall and Jirai together. On paper, this would more than make up for the loss of Northumbria. It seemed like things were okay at first. Jirai was doing better than ever after that, but notice I said seemed. There's always a catch. Because money had been tight for so long, a lot of Jirai's council members, who also happened to be top-ranking merchants as well, were more than happy to sell off some of their historic buildings and landmarks to the Empire. So the Imperial influence began to spread pretty quickly into Jirai even before its official annexation. Crow remarks that it wasn't too dissimilar to what Crossbell was going through, except there wasn't nearly as much pushback here as there was over there. Which leads me to believe maybe that whole Northumbria assault incident, combined with what I'm about to tell you next, might not have been a coincidence and could have been orchestrated. Anyway, one day someone blew up the new railway line. Now, under normal circumstances, you'd probably want to repair that as soon as possible to resume business. However, the Empire used this opportunity to berate Jirai for having lackluster security. Kinda similar to how Osborne and Rocksmith criticized Crossbell for not having proper military protection, while also being the main reasons why they couldn't upgrade the Guardian Force into a proper military. Anyway, the Empire gave them shit for the incident and said if they didn't figure out who was responsible and get the whole situation cleaned up, they were going to withdraw all Imperial capital, which, under the current circumstances, now makes up most of Jirai's wealth. No one could figure out who actually did it, and that's when Osborne came over and offered to let it slide, and Jirai would be annexed into the Empire in exchange for that. Crow's granddad must have sensed that something was off because he opposed the idea. Unfortunately, the entire city council as well as a good number of citizens were all for it, probably just desperate to get business back to the way things were. The entire city blamed the railway incident on Crow's granddad and kept it moving. Like I said, I suspect it was someone from the Empire and it was done on purpose just to put Jirai in this desperate situation in the first place. The entire city basically turned on Crow's grandpa and he resigned from his position as mayor. What's interesting is that Crow remarks that everyone in the city knew his grandfather wasn't the culprit, but I guess because they just needed someone to blame and he seemed like the easiest target due to his staunch opposition to the annexation, they went with that. Crow's grandpa reluctantly approved the decision and Jirai City became Jirai SEZ, Special Economic Zone. Crow's grandfather died shortly after that, and while Crow never confirmed it, I suspect the mental turmoil he suffered in light of those events probably got to him, especially considering he was already pretty old. So now Crow had no one. He kinda just wandered around until he bumped into Duke Cayenne, who also held a grudge against the Chancellor. Cayenne gave Crow the funding he needed to start the Imperial Liberation Front, and not long after that he met Vita, who would visit Cayenne every now and then. Vita led Crow through a similar set of trials that Reed in Class 7 went through, and that was how Crow got Ordine. He then went to Thor's alongside Toa, Angelica, and George, with his goal being to lay low until it was time to take out the Chancellor. I actually really like this story because while it does a good job of explaining Crow's motivations, it doesn't try too hard to excuse what he's doing. It's understandable why he hates Osborne. Osborne ruined his life as he knew it and, albeit indirectly, took his grandfather from him. Crow never really tries to explain away what he's doing or mask it as morally correct. He simply says, it's fairly normal for a student to want to avenge his master's defeat. And that's certainly a reason, I guess. It's personal. He just wants revenge. Crow sort of looms over the game as a goal for Reen in Class 7 to reach. Sure, there's ending the war, but there's also Reen's desire to rectify the rather humiliating defeat he suffered at the end of Cold Steel 1, as well as everyone wanting to bring him back from his life of terrorism. Which kinda doesn't make sense because again, even if they convinced him to throw in the towel and come back with them, he's still gonna at the very least get arrested for all the shit he did before and during Cold Steel 1. Crow fights alongside Vita in the not-so-final dungeon. Then he fights Reen and Valimar using Ordine and loses that fight too. When Duke Cayenne completely loses it after Vita and Crow make plans to walk out on him, Crow, using Ordine, does help Reen defeat the Vermilion Apocalypse. But as I said earlier, everything comes with a price. While they were successful and freed Prince Cedric from the mech, Ordine got stabbed in the lower chest area during the fight, which was right where the cockpit was. Reen in Class 7 check up on him, and it turns out Crow got stabbed in the same spot that he shot Osborne at. He says some parting words to each member of Class 7, and then he dies. Actually, I guess you could call it the murder of Crow. Anyone? Come on, that was pretty good, right? Right?
You're terrible.
Black Milliam, I mean Altina, barely does anything in this one either. She's pretty much just there to provide support whenever needed. I guess just like with Milliam, her allegiance is to the Imperial government, so it's more so she goes where Osborne tells her to go. She works alongside the Noble Alliance right up until Rufus enters the Infernal Castle, and then she helps to detain Duke Cayenne. Upon Osborne's return, she's seen accompanying Reen, after he became the government's bitch. But yeah, while she seems interesting, especially with how much she contrasts with Milliam, they don't do too much with her in this game. She does have a cool outfit though. Duke Alborea is, of course, Eustace and Rufus's father, and leads one of the 4 great houses. Duke Alborea is actually kind of a background character for a good chunk of the game, his presence and influence being made known by others that he's sent to do his bidding as opposed to the Duke just doing things himself. He does have a brief conversation with Eustace early in the game, and the scene does a great job at showcasing how much of an ass he is. The thing that's interesting about Alborea though, is he's kind of normal. He's not evil in an over-the-top mustache twirling way, nor does he really have the means to develop into something like that. He's not the great swordsman that his son Rufus is, he isn't a terrorist like any of the Liberation Front members, he's not a Jaeger with years of fighting experience, he doesn't know any fancy magic spells like Vita or have some crazy powers like McBurn, and he doesn't have delusions of grandeur like his superior Duke Cayenne. Well, at least none that I know of. In a desperate attempt to secure Princess Alphen, he sends the Jaegers to attack Ymir, like I had said before. When Keldic is freed from the Noble Alliance occupation, he sends his provincial army and some soldats to trash the place and burn it down, resulting in many injuries and even someone's death. Keep in mind, this is his own territory, but establishing his rule and putting the common people in a state of fear was far more important to him. The things Duke Alborea does as an antagonist feels very realistic, which can sometimes make villains like him even scarier. Like, you'll bump into a character like Arianrod or McBurn, and while their strength is terrifying on paper, they're so unrealistically powerful that there's a certain detachment from reality, and seeing them in action on screen is actually more so fascinating than terrifying. But characters like Duke Alborea, all he really had was his nobility, lots of status, and money. And a lot of times, I guess that's all someone really needs to fuck shit up. Duke Cayenne is the main antagonist of the game. He also leads one of the 4 great houses and was also the primary instigator of the Civil War. Outside of that, he sort of comes across as a figurehead, mostly due to the fact that he absolutely refuses to get his hands dirty, and every time he needed something really important done, much like Duke Alborea, he put someone else up to it. I almost want to compare him to Dieter, but even Dieter had a little more physical involvement with his plan, because he was willing to pilot the White Ion during his fight with the Special Support section, so yeah. Probably the biggest example of Cayenne outsourcing the physical labor to someone else to realize his vision was when he got in touch with Crow shortly after Jirai got annexed and his grandfather died. Like I said, he funded the Imperial Liberation Front, who in turn would scheme to kill Osborne for him. Crow awakening Ordine also inspired Cayenne to request the Soldat units, so he commissioned Professor Schmidt, a well-known scientist and one of Professor Epstein's 3 students, to work on those. That's why they needed all that iron back in Cold Steel 1 to help mass produce those. Near the end of the game, Cayenne's true motives are revealed. So it turns out during the War of the Lions, which was a civil war between the sons of Valius Rice Arnor, I guess they were all competing for the throne, there was one brother in particular, Orthros. He managed to find and revive a Divine Knight underneath the Imperial capital of Heimdall. Testarossa, the Vermilion Knight. Testarossa was different from the other Divine Knights though, because while extremely powerful, it was also extremely unstable, courtesy of the last battle it was involved in. But regardless, for a while Orthros was the only one who had a Divine Knight in his possession, so not only did he manage to lock down Heimdall with minimal pushback, but this gave him a huge advantage over the other princes. And when things did start getting rough for Orthros, he upped the ante by creating the Vermilion Apocalypse, which was a godlike form of Testarossa, as well as raising the Infernal Castle. Dreichels, as you know, emerged from the whole thing victorious. As punishment for after awakening a corrupted Divine Knight and causing a calamity, Dreikl's cut off Orthros' lineage from the rest of the Arnor family. He did this for two reasons. The first, of course, being punishment, but the other reason was to protect the Cayenne dukedom. You see, Orthros' mother was a Cayenne. She wasn't a duchess, but still a Cayenne nonetheless. In order to keep the residents of Erebonia from hating the Cayenne family, I guess Dreikl's kept that little detail regarding Orthros' lineage out of the history books. And as I said, this allowed House Cayenne to continue to exist as if nothing happened. However, being effectively kicked out of the Arnor family tree was very embarrassing to the Cayenne family, and those feelings trickled right down to their descendants, the current Duke Cayenne included. So Cayenne literally did all of what he did in an attempt to reenact that segment of the War of the Lions and reclaim, his words, the proofs of ownership over the city that Emperor Orthros had disgracefully stripped away. Of course, that didn't work out, and it's due to the efforts of not just Class 7, but some other characters who end up doing him in. Rufus is the Noble Alliance's chief of staff. While he appeared in Cold Steel 1, he didn't do too much. He doesn't make too many appearances in this game either, but his role in the game is significant. I wasn't too surprised to see him working with the Noble Alliance during the Civil War, considering he's Duke Alberea's firstborn. He's kind of in and out throughout the game. Most notably, he gives the Crimson Wings the intel they need to head into Oryxport and arrest his father, with his reasoning being that Duke Alberea burning down Celtic was a step too far, and even the Noble Alliance didn't condone his actions. And he meant it, but he did have other reasons for wanting his father dealt with. After Class 7 stops the Vermilion Apocalypse, Rufus shows up out of nowhere and turns on Cayenne, much to the man's dismay. So it turns out Rufus was an Ironblood the whole time, and he was in the Noble Alliance as a double agent. His purpose was to wait for either side, but in this case the Alliance, to hit its lowest point and then turn the situation on its head by revealing, drumroll please, that this motherfucker Osborn was still alive after all. Well, either he faked the death or he did die but was resurrected. The game doesn't go into any detail on how he came back, just that he's back. And to be fair, they did reveal in Trails to Azure that he did survive and was even seen during the end credits. While Osborn's screen time is literally just a few minutes, this is still huge. You're left questioning how he came back, and it happens right after Rufus suddenly shows up. Which, by the way, makes Rufus a twist villain, but in a different way, because it's a twist that hurts the current villain, Cayenne, far more than it hurts the heroes. At least for now. Very similar to Grimwood revealing himself and then immediately turning on Dieter alongside everyone else in Azure. Osborn also makes known his plan to reunite the Erebonian army and occupy Crossbell. He even tells Vita that he's taking over the Phantasmal Blaze plan because he wasn't sussy enough as is, I guess. Osborn then drops the other shoe, the fact that he's Reen's biological father. And then that segment of the game just ends. No explanation as to who Reen's mother is or why Osborn abandoned him in the first place, it just ends. Osborn's return also marks Reen's ascension to celebrity status. It doesn't take long for everyone in the country to recognize Reen as the hero of Erebonia who ended the Civil War. Reen has not been able to just walk down a street full of people and not have them gawk at him since then. Osborn may as well have put a curse on this man. We interrupt our regularly scheduled program to bring you barriers, 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 barriers! Do you recall the days of yore when St. Lloyd first put the fear of the barrier into us? It is with great pleasure that I inform you that after a much-needed break from the series, our Lord and Savior has returned with enough barriers to last us an arc and a half. Return to a newly renovated Crossbell, now rendered in eye-popping, glorious 3D. Central Square, glorious 3D. Special Support Section Building, glorious 3D. Crossbell News Service, glorious 3D. Orcus Tower, glorious 3D. Geofront, glorious 3D. Lloyd himself, glorious 3D. Grace, glorious 3D. Rind, glorious 3D. Cow, glorious 3D. Risha, glorious 3D. This segment of the game is called Divertissement, and it actually addresses a small grievance I had back when playing Azure, how the Imperial occupation happened after the game's conclusion and everything that went down during that time was relegated to the credits scene. Well, it seems Falcom themselves were fully aware of this, as it's addressed to a satisfactory extent here. It begins with Osborn putting Rufus in charge of Crossbell as its first Governor General. It then cuts to Grace and her crew talking about the recent events from both the end of Azure and a bit of this game. It then cuts to Geofront Sector Chapter E, where two familiar-looking characters are discussing some seemingly important matters. So it turns out Lloyd became somewhat of a resistance member once the occupation began. He and Risha were in Geofront to find a computer deep inside of the sector and back up its data to a special device that Tio had given him. While none of the other Special Support Section characters make an on-screen appearance, they are all mentioned by name. That's pretty much the gist of it. As I said, most of the chapter is one large dungeon. At the end, Lloyd and Risha bump into Reen and Altina, who had come down there to stop them. Reen is now a military officer for the Empire, by the way. They fight, which is an interesting experience, the trope of the current protagonist meeting the previous one. I had said during my playthrough that it really reminded me of having to battle Red in Pokemon Gen 2, albeit inverted since you're playing as the previous guy and fighting the current guy. Lloyd and Risha actually do put up a pretty damn good fight. Reen, running out of time since by then the data had finished backing up, calls up Valimar and smashes the computer. Bro, rage quit. Lloyd and Risha do manage to get away with the data though. Well, more specifically, Reen let them pass, and Lloyd and Reen kind of came to a mutual understanding of each other's situations. The next section is the Epilogue. That's right, we're still not done. Reen returns from his war duties to continue his studies and just enjoy his last bit of schooling before graduation. There's one final string of side quests, and then the last bit of story happens. Reen is walking past the old schoolhouse, and his friends progressively approach the location too. It turns out it's glowing again the same way it did at the end of the last game. They step in, and it doesn't look anything like it did in the last game. What the fuck is all this? It's called the Reverie Corridor, and Class 7 and Company decides this issue is a bit too strange to just leave alone and decides to investigate it. This is the final, we promise you're done now dungeon. It's pretty bare bones as far as design is concerned, definitely not as scenic as the Infernal Castle or any of the final dungeons in previous games. However, it does have some unique things going for it. First of all, the dungeon floors are randomly generated. The layout of each floor changes every time you exit the schoolhouse and then re-enter. Second, every playable character you had ever used in the game is playable here. Everyone. Even the likes of Alphen and Elise, who you only got to use for maybe like half an hour each, are playable here. There are even special items you can purchase that allow you to play as Crow, Vita, Lloyd, Risha, and Altina if you want, though their appearance in the corridor isn't actually them. It's a special mirror accessory that you overlay onto an existing character of your choice. Everyone gets to the end and they bump into what looks to be a shiny Loa Erebonius. Dude had a Smash Bros ult. It calls itself Loa Luciferia. It's the shadow of Loa Erebonius, and it was awakened during the whole Vermilion Apocalypse fiasco. So what threat does it pose? Is it dangerous? Does it have plans to take over the world? Does it yield a sweet reward like its darker cousin? No. And it even explicitly says this during the cutscene. But Reen and everyone else opt to fight it anyway, and honestly, while playing it in the moment, I didn't understand why they were doing that. But quite a few of you guys reminded me that Class 7's time together was coming to a close. They just wanted one last opportunity to overcome something together, and given time to think about it, yeah, I can see it. It's maybe easier to view the Reverie Corridor as like the mother of all bonding events. Just because it was pointless in the grand scheme of things doesn't mean that it was pointless to Class 7 as individuals. After they beat Loa Luciferia, the reality starts to set in that this is it for Class 7, at least for now. Millium, who wasn't even aware she was capable of crying, was the first one to burst into tears too, as I had mentioned before. Not long after that, all of Class 7, except Reen, take their leave from the Academy. While in-game they were a bit ambiguous about this part, it turns out Class 7 took accelerated courses to graduate early. Again, excluding Reen since he was of course helping the army during that time. They all part ways and then the story ends, like, for real this time. Cold Steel 2 was overall a pretty solid entry in the series. While I did have some issues with it, like its pacing or having 3 endings and fooling you multiple times into thinking each ending was going to be the end of the game. Hell, if you didn't know about the Black Records beforehand, technically the Epilogue isn't even the true ending of the game either, so funny how that works, I guess. As is the case with every arc I've played so far, I do like it more than Cold Steel 1, but I also think that compared to Sky SC or Azure, Cold Steel 2 is actually the weakest follow-up game so far. at least for me. And that's not to say it's bad by any means, it just does feel a bit flat compared to those two. And that's mostly because I guess it serves a bit of a different purpose. It was almost exclusively about the Civil War, as well as answering a couple of questions that Azure raised. What was going on in Erebonia after Crossbell, well, illegitimately, declared independence? How did the Noble Alliance fumble so badly when they had such a colossal advantage over the Reformists? What was the Blaze half of the Phantasmal Blaze plan? You know, just a few examples. Anyway, to anyone who's been following this channel, you already know that I've started Cold Steel 3 already, so that will continue. Once I've completely finished my Cold Steel 2 coverage, frequency on those videos should pick up, but for now, that marks the end of this video, so do leave a like if you enjoyed it, sub to the channel if you haven't already. A special thanks to all channel members for your continued support, it's much appreciated, and I will see you all again very soon.